And welcome back as we continue our episode conversations on COVID-19. And one word we have heard very much since March is the term testing. Whether it is going to the hospital, get a test, whether it is drive-through testing, there is a very unique form of testing at Susquehanna University. And here to talk about that with us right now is Dr. Dave Richard, a professor of biology at Susquehanna University. Welcome, Dr. Richard.
Thank you.
And Christopher Bailey, who is the Director of Facilities at Susquehanna University. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, Chris.
Okay, so let's go back a little ways. We got to set the stage for this unique form of testing. I'm just curious if either of you realize the implications for the university and as well as yourself personally and professionally. And we'll start with you, Dr. Richard.
When the virus really started to take a hold in the US, which was probably back in late January, early February, it began to occur to me and to some of my colleagues that this was something we're going to have to pay way more attention to than we were currently doing. And then when we got to early March and it really started to explode, especially in Pennsylvania and New York and places like that, that's when it really took hold. That's when we really realized that this was going to be a game changer for a long period of time. Many of us essentially wrote 2020 off at that point as a normal year, that we were not going to get back to normal at all this year. And I think that's still absolutely the case.
Yeah, you're a biology professor, so you had a little more unique insight to this than most of us.
I think possibly, although virology is not my field, but I have a broad understanding of molecular biology and viruses and RNA and some of the techniques that we're going to talk about later on with regard to testing, specifically the PCR test that I'm sure many people have heard of. So I was familiar with all of that. And I think that was one of the reasons why I was actually brought into this. I wasn't initially a part of the program, of the COVID team. But in roughly midsummer, I suppose, June or something like that, I was invited in as to sort of guide and advise and oversee and help people make policies that made sense scientifically.
Okay, Chris, did you realize at the time how much it would affect you?
Well, I think even stepping back further than that, Susquehanna University has a very important program. Part of our education here is the Global Opportunities Program, the GO program. And the fact that we had students abroad starting even early as probably late November last year, in December, when the news reports were starting to pick up about China, about this new novel virus and disease starting to develop in Wuhan, China. We actually started meeting as a group as early as December. There was a small core group, basically a part of our incident response team with the senior leadership, just to start to get our ducks in a row, to understand what the implications. And there it was more about the students who were abroad. As travel started to become restricted, and we did have programs in China and in other parts of Asia, just starting to get an understanding what the impacts possibly could be to those programs. So then coming out of winter break, it picked up, as Dr. Richard said, it picked up steam. We started to realize it was going to get a lot bigger, a lot faster, especially once it hit the United States, once it arrived on our shores. And at that point, the fact that putting Dr. Richard in charge is basically bringing him in as the science to make sure that everything we did from then on was grounded in the science of the pandemic. Obviously, there was a lot of fog of war, continues to be somewhat during that time when we didn't really understand the implications of it, but we knew that there was some possibility that it was going to get much worse. I don't think at that time, until we got into March, and we went on spring break, and then the students weren't brought back after spring break. We went fully remote and pivoted that way. Then I think we started to get a sense of, okay, if we have to be closed now, what is the fall going to look like? What is the summer going to look like? And starting to really think about all the implications. And to say we built the car while it was going down the road is a good way to explain it. trying to stay ahead of the information, vet the information, make sure that what we could, and a lot of the things we wanted to do would change day to day in terms of what was available to us, what was potentially available to us, and what was the best science for it. So I think we got a jump as opposed to other institutions. I think we were ahead of the game. It didn't feel like we were ahead of the game, but when I talked to my peers, I think we were pretty far ahead of the game with our plans going into the summer. It changed pretty much every aspect of operations, from employee safety, to the students, to food service, to the way the education going to hybrid models. So every aspect and the speed at which it changed, the adoption of the technologies and folks rolling with the punches. I don't think anyone could have anticipated of how significant of an impact it would be.
How much, Chris, did it help you in your efforts to have the students gone and then to have the summer to get ready for the fall?
Absolutely. That was, and to have the summer, really, it was a different summer because we truly were shut down. The university, normally the summer, we still, we operate year round. We have summer programs, camps, athletics, and those events weren't happening. So it really allowed us to focus from a facility standpoint and from a planning standpoint on what the fall opening would be. That was the critical thing. How do we safely bring the students back to campus? Because we all realize that in education in person, while we can deliver remotely, it's not the same experience. The education that our professors provide, interacting with them on a regular basis is special sauce, is what you need in the type of education. So being able to have the summer to focus on how to best deliver that and to bring students back safely, it was critical. I don't know how else we would have done it in terms of making the changes we needed to do without having that time to do it.
Dave, did you realize right from the start the level at which you would get involved in this whole process?
Not really. I was obviously following everything that was going on in the media, and I think I had a slightly more gloomy appreciation of what was going to happen than Chris does. But my interest was mostly just sort of academic at that point, and it was only when I was brought in to start advising that I really started to get involved. And it's not quite a full-time job, which is lucky because I'm still doing my other job as well. But it's certainly taking an inordinate amount of time to put things into place. And I'm actually really pleased with how the university's pulled together on this. People have been magnificent. For the most part, the students, the faculty, the staff have all been rowing in the same direction, and we're all interested in having an on-campus, in-person educational experience. Excuse me. And so, it's been a lot of work, but so far it's been broadly successful and actually really, really interesting from my standpoint.
So you're the director of the COVID response team at SU. How wise do you think it was to have someone with your background put in charge?
I mean, obviously it didn't have to be me. There are a number of people who I think could have contributed to this. I think it has a number of benefits. Obviously there's the academic or the scientific expertise, and there is a somewhat different way of thinking in science. You do tend to be a lot more objective and perhaps a little less emotional about some things. So that's very helpful. I think the other part is, and this, I don't mean this to sound arrogant or anything, I have a certain standing around the campus, and I think people generally respect me and the work that I've done here. And so I've become somewhat of a point person in talking to the community. So I write a newsletter every week, which seems to be quite well received by faculty and staff. And my reputation is, I believe, one of speaking truth to power. And I think that has helped the effort enormously, because I believe people have trusted me when I talk to them.
Once again, when did you start meeting? How often did you meet? And what were your objectives right from the start?
We meet 3 times a week. obviously on Zoom, and usually for an hour, sometimes for longer, and obviously other times as needed. I started joining in these meetings, I think it was very early July, where we were talking very much about things like wipes and hand sanitizers and things like that. And we weren't at that stage, I think, really addressing the major issues of aerosols and how do we manage ventilation safely on campus? How do we actually manage to have this number of people breathing, potentially breathing the same air, and not passing COVID from one to another? And so that's when I think we started to move more in that direction. And the testing situation in the US, as I know you're aware, has been highly problematic, that we don't have the capacity as a nation that we need. And it's not just the US, there are other countries as well. My home country, the United Kingdom, is in the same boat. But we have worked pretty hard to sort of move our program in a relatively diverse way with regard to testing. So we have a number of individual testing systems available to us. We're actually working on a third one right now. And we believe we have capacity for individual testing that will allow us to hopefully meet any challenge that comes our way. And then, of course, we instituted the process of wastewater testing. And that we actually started doing our wastewater testing about a week before the first people started coming back on campus, just so that we could get a baseline zero for all of the buildings that we were testing. And then we ramped it up from there to where we are today.
All right, we'll talk about the wastewater in a second. Chris, when this process started to gain strength in March, April, May, as the facilities guy, did you realize right away all the changes that would have to be made across campus?
Well, I think to what David said, initially there was a lot of focus on the potential of surface contamination, transfer through touch, contaminated surfaces. And that's why you saw this logical run on hand sanitizer and wipes and just that whole market just getting blown apart. And so we knew there was going to be a certain level of change. I think the realization and when we came to that realization when Dave was brought in and really started to think about and recognize that the focus has to be on aerosols and particle transfer and ventilation. And so, then our focus, while we still, it's important to be focusing on cleaning and all of the things, the changes we put in place, with providing sanitation stations and proper PPE, make sure everyone has access to it. And we're doing, our cleaners are EPA certified against these types of viruses to make sure that whatever cleaning we are doing is effective. Really focusing on how the buildings, what are people going to do in the buildings? Because, as Dave, we started, Dr. Richard had identified a model that was being used, developed to model, mathematically model different spaces and the aerosols that were generated, assuming you have someone who is producing viruses based on what they were doing. So I'll give you some example. A student sitting at a desk, not talking, is generating even if they're sick, they're not necessarily generating a lot of particles. But someone singing or doing athletics is going to be generating a number of particles and aerosols to a much greater extent. So it was not only, we had to start looking at how do folks use the building and what things can we do to try to control that. And it was multifaceted. We definitely took an approach as an engineer. My background's in civil engineering. But multimodal failure analysis. You don't, the worst thing you can have in engineering is a single point of failure. You put all your eggs in one basket, and somewhat to what Dave was saying about testing being, we have trying to expand different avenues, so we're not dependent on one facet of our testing program necessarily, but they support each other. The same thing was true with the ventilation and controls, and as we worked forward, we started looking at individual spaces. First and foremost is reducing the number of people, so we can maintain a certain level of social distancing. Making sure that mask compliance is going to be critically important, because it is. Mask compliance is it. That's the one thing we can all do to protect each other, is wear masks and wear them properly. And then going beyond that, looking at the ventilation in the buildings, changing what's called the MERV rating on our filters to allow the systems that have to recirculate air through a space to actually capture particles that are expressed, or at least potentially capture them, hopefully capture them. And then add in other things like HEPA filtration, high efficiency particulate filters, in certain spaces where we know we either aren't going to get the preferred ventilation we would want, or to provide additional protection. And even to the point where every space, we made the decision that even though our residents are considered, if they're in a room and they're a roommate, they're considered a family unit, putting a certain level of UVC technology there with a small personal disinfectant system that is circulating the air through a UVC chamber that would actually reduce viral load if there was a viral load in the space. So yeah, it's we definitely started looking harder and harder at the ventilation, how people are using the buildings, how the occupants, and then going back and educating the occupants. As they've said, talking to pretty much everybody on campus about their operations and what we can do to make them safer in this new reality of COVID.
Was it everything you talked about uniform across all buildings, or were classrooms treated differently than dorm rooms?
Classrooms were treated differently from dorm rooms, in that they have higher occupancy and they have different levels of activity. And as Chris was saying, singing can create about 900 times more viral release than sitting breathing. It's a huge number. So we have a number of voice teachers on campus in the music department, and we worked extensively with them to develop protocols so that they could still teach their voice lessons and not run a risk of an infected student spreading the virus on from there. And I think, Chris, that probably took about 3 or 4 weeks of talking to the music department to get that all wrangled. It was quite an effort. So different classrooms get treated in different ways. We also created a number of outside classrooms, put in some tents outside, some of which have been divided into zones, so you can have multiple classes going at the same time. Others are more individual. And then, of course, some faculty are just being entrepreneurial, and they're finding a space to sit outside on a nice day and teach their classes. Here in the science building where I am, we're lucky in that we have absolutely terrific ventilation. But even so, we have been following all of the same protocols for reducing class size and maximizing distancing and so on. In the dorms, quite frankly, we have less ability to control what students do in the dorms than we do anywhere else on campus. But we have some fairly strict rules about visitation between dorms into personal rooms and things like that. Which haven't always been very well received by the students, but it's one of the things we have to do in order to minimize the spread should spread start. So,
okay.
I was just going to say the rules that I just want to add in, and they're rules that are being enforced. I mean, students have been sent home.
Yep.
When that is the control, and it's this idea of we're all in this together, but each individual person has a responsibility. They have a part to play, and that means, from a student standpoint, it's following the rules, because we're not making these up to be hard or difficult. We're making them up to try to reduce the risk of, and extend the semester and keep everyone here.
I do think, though, that we need to think about this almost in terms of the inevitability of an infection on campus. We set up as you've heard, we've set up extensive testing programs. I know we're still to talk about the wastewater testing. And at the same time, as Chris was saying there, we've set up a whole series of measures to mitigate an infection once it's on campus. So all of the filtration, all of the UV stuff, all of the classroom occupancy, all of that is based around an assumption that we have infected individuals on campus. Now, can we continue to operate with those operate safely with those people on campus while we try and identify them and isolate them from the population? And then the third piece is that we have put an extensive amount of work into having our faculty learn how to teach online and teach in a hybrid setting where they only have a certain number of the class in the room at any one time. And we had a huge long training program this summer, which also goes back to the benefit of nothing else happening over the summer, in which most of the faculty became pretty well educated in both the sort of pedagogical side of it and the technical side of how do you run a Zoom meeting in two places with 20 students in one place and 20 students in another whilst managing multiple cameras and all of that sort of stuff. And I'll be honest, we all had a few teething troubles with it, but I think we're actually beginning to get pretty good at it. So it's a multi-stage thing: testing, prevention, and then the basic mission of the institution, which is to educate.
Now, as far as the personal testing, Dave, did you settle upon a uniform way of doing it? Are students coming back with the expectation they'll be tested regularly or as they show symptoms?
Well, it's sort of all of the above in one sense. We tested everybody before they came back on campus, and that was with a spit test. So looking at PCR test, but on spits rather than on the nasal swab. So everybody was tested there, and they weren't allowed back on campus unless they had a negative result. And so that was one thing. We instituted the sort of campus-wide wastewater testing, but we also, for those students who are not covered by the wastewater testing, which is about 20% of the student population, their buildings are in a place where we can't sample. Or for those students who are commuters, who are living out in the community and coming in on a daily basis, those students who are doing internships out in the community, and so on. So for those folk, we're setting up a random, or we have set up a random testing program. So each week we test about 20 to 25% of that population. We are obviously having to manage resources, so it's not feasible to do as some institutions have done and test everybody every 2 days. I mean, that runs into the millions of dollars. So what we're trying to do is use what resources we have as efficiently and as safely as we can. So we have currently we have two types of personal test, one out of Yale University, one out of Juniata College. We're working on an in-house system, so we'll be able to do very rapid tests, non-diagnostic tests, but screening tests within an hour or two on campus, which will be a huge step forward. And then for symptomatic patients, they're tested through the Geisinger operation, so separate from us. So as I said, we have this fairly diverse system. So let's say we lose one of our testing options, we still have others that we can go to.
Okay, having laid the groundwork, I think we can get to the point, and we mentioned it several times throughout this interview, to talk about what makes Susquehanna University unique as far as testing. I remember reading and hearing a while back talk about how COVID had turned up in human waste. And I'm assuming that is how this whole testing procedure of testing wastewater came about. How did it come about for Susquehanna University? How did you guys find out about this?
To some extent, I mean, I first became aware of it through the media. I read newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, things like that, and it started to come up as an option in the chatter and some of the articles there. And I believe Chris and co had already been looking at it before I was brought onto the team. So I'm not claiming credit for it, but it looked like a very efficient way of rapidly screening a large number of people simultaneously. And so as we started to think about this more and more, we, and this is mostly Chris, made inquiries as to how we might get a hold of the equipment we need and how we might work with contracted companies to manage the testing process. I will say one thing though, we're not absolutely unique in this. There are other institutions who have been doing this. The University of Arizona has done it. And they've found cases through their wastewater testing system. I believe our system is actually more sophisticated than theirs in that they essentially have a jug on the end of a stick that they stick down into the sewer to sample. Whereas what we're doing is we're using these units that we drop down into the wastewater system, at various places around campus, and it samples continuously over a 24-hour period. So rather than getting a snapshot of the wastewater, we're getting a broader in time sample of the wastewater. And then every 2 days, we are sampling from those, we're up to 13 sites around campus. Every 2 days, we're sampling from those, and they get sent off to a lab for analysis. I'll let Chris talk about the more technical end of it.
Yeah, the first, I think it first came to our attention, it was way back in March and April. And again, it was through media. It was something to the effect of some communities had in the past, and this isn't necessarily new. They've actually used this before for other viral and bacterial outbreaks in communities, where they'll go to the wastewater treatment plant. And a lot of diseases, when you get sick, your body starts to shed virus and bacterial and microbial material that you can test for. And so they've done this before for other outbreaks, where they go to the wastewater treatment plant and actually start to use that as a survey tool to say, okay, do we have this disease in the community? And it's a pretty broad kind of red flag tool. You either do or you don't. Somewhat you can tell the loading, but so that's kind of what got the ball rolling. A couple of universities come on saying they were going to do it, Arizona being one of them. So we had a pretty good working relationship with an environmental engineering firm that we have worked with on other wastewater projects, not dealing with viruses and bacteria, actually dealing with the traditional TOCs and BOD and things that you measure in sewage when you're trying to figure out, manage a sewage system. And you have to remember, a university like ours, and a lot of universities, but we're better set up for it because being in a more rural setting where we have an encompassed campus, a closed campus, where we own a lot of the infrastructure, we have access to the infrastructure, the sewage pipes directly, lends us this ability to do this kind of testing to be able to grab these samples. So this engineering firm we have worked with was able to, we knew they had the samplers, these composite samplers that David was talking about, they had access to them. And what's nice about that is it gives you the best chance of catching something. By doing a 24-hour, and in wastewater, in the wastewater world, in civil engineering, that is a better way of doing things because it gives you a better sense of what's happening over the day, as opposed to going down the pipe literally as a flush of a toilet. So it's either here or it's gone. By doing it over the day, you're catching it throughout the day to make sure that you give yourself the best, widest net to test for these. We are currently doing 13 points. And what that does is, I think this had been mentioned before, covers about 80% of our residents. 80% of our residents live somewhere where we can access the pipe. And it gives us a certain ability to identify by that sampling point all the students behind that. So in some cases, it might be, 150 students live in a building which we're sampling. And if we get a hot there, then we have to do something else. It doesn't tell us directly. We can't go back and say, okay, it came from room, the second floor bathroom at 2 o'clock. We just know if it comes back hot after the testing, it usually takes about 48 to 72 hours, but 48 hours past it. If it comes back hot, then we have to do something else. And I think Dave can talk a little bit more about kind of what the next, we have to use a better surveillance tool to get down to the individual so we can start to isolate and contact trace and do all the other things. But this gives us an ability to quickly survey 80% of our campus population every 2 days. Because the chances are during that 24-hour period, if they're a sick individual and they're in the res hall, chances are they're going to use the restroom during that period, and we're going to catch it.
Yeah, in a sense, we're using this like our early warning system. So this tells us if something has happened. Then what we need to do, as Chris was saying, is we need to find out what happened. And so if we get a hot wastewater test on a dorm, essentially what happens is all of the students in that residence sent a text asking them or requiring them to return to their rooms. They are then invited to set up an appointment for an individual test the next morning. And they are provided with all the resources, food and such like, in their rooms we have a a set of care coordinators that we've set up that will work with the students in the dorms to make sure they have what they need, make sure they have all the connection that they need so they can still continue to attend classes. They deliver meals to them through meal services. And then next morning, after Chris and his guys have set up the testing tents, our testers, and these are all athletic trainers who work on campus, they go and administer the test, the nasal swab test, which then gets sent off to another lab for the lab in Juniata for analysis. And then usually from Juniata, we get the results back in 24 hours or so. They're a little quicker, which is great. We get those results back, and if they're all negative, then the students are released. And if we identify the positives, then those positives are more formally isolated in other facilities on campus. So, we had a little bit of a scare a couple of weeks ago when we had what was a very marginal wastewater positive. But out of an abundance of caution, we immediately retested it. We had another test going the next day through wastewater. And we also did all of the personal testing as well. And so we were able to rule out the infection in essentially 3 different ways. So by the time we were done with that, we were both very confident that we had identified that this was not a true positive. And we were also more confident in our systems because we'd had a chance to dry run them in relatively, in safe conditions, even though we didn't know it at the time. So that was actually, I think that turned out to be a blessing. So we've had other incidents on campus, and we're using our system to try and manage those.
Would the general public of the campus be even remotely aware of the wastewater testing? It's not out in the open, is it?
No, it's down in the ground. They're sort of trash cans, small trash can size units that get dropped in through manholes. And they're electronic based units, so they manage the collection. And then the next day, one of our guys goes and pulls them out again, processes it, and sends it off. So unless you are standing next to the manhole when it's being administered, you would have no clue what's going on. And I think one thing that's looking forward, a long way forward, for when we next build buildings on campus, I think one of the recommendations is likely to be, we need to build in better ways to tap into sewage that's leaving the building, and tap into sewage with a greater degree of resolution than we know it's one of 150 people. So narrow it down to that second floor bathroom if possible. And so, that's, I think, one of the lessons I've been sort of carrying forward for future academic buildings, if there are any.
It's interesting you bring that up, because I wanted to finish on, with everything we've talked about, we're mid-September. You still have most of the semester and a second semester, hopefully, to go. Do you feel like you have all the bases covered? And this is a question for both of you. Do you feel optimistic now about your future there? Dave?
I don't know that if you can ever be confident that you've got all your bases covered. I mean, this is an ongoing thing. We don't know what's going to happen out in society and how that's going to affect us. I think if we can maintain a degree of isolation of our campus population, then our chances of making it through the semester with only a few positives is probably pretty good. And I don't know that there's very much more we could do without sort of getting to some really draconian sort of measures of locking everybody in their rooms and only letting them out to go to the bathroom, sort of thing, and doing that for the entire population. Clearly, that's not feasible. But I think we've tried to anticipate as much as we can. We've tried to read as much of the literature out there as we can and make decisions based upon that. And I think we're in as good a position as good a position as we could possibly expect to be at this point. Chris?
Yeah, I mean, any system or any setup where you're depending on human beings as part of that system will always surprise you. I think Dave had said that we expect to have virus show up on our campus. It's just mathematically, statistically, it is going to show up here. We just have a size of a population and a population of a certain age that we're going to see it. I think we have, compared to our peers and other institutes and institutions, I think we are better set up than most to be able to quickly identify these issues and have the systems, people, processes ready to get engaged, to put into place to help control these so they are manageable incidents as opposed to a wide outbreak. If we get these beyond, as we saw in the United States and in communities, it's at that point at which hospitals are getting overwhelmed. When people are getting sicker at a quicker rate than the hospitals are able to manage them, that's when things start to break down. And you really start to have some major issues. And ours is a little bit, it's a smaller thing, but our educational mission can continue as long as we keep things at a manageable level. And I believe we have as good a shot as anyone else, given the systems that we've put in place. I mean, I'm confident we'll catch it, meaning we'll identify it. It will either through a student going to health services, because any suspect symptoms are going to be tested right away. The student's going to be isolated. We have a system in place for decent contact tracing of those suspects, so we can identify out, kind of going out from the bullseye, the students that are most suspect. And we have, and are continuing to build out testing capabilities to be able to do that, to evaluate. And to our educational mission, the systems are in place. They're not perfect. They're getting better. The people are getting more comfortable using them. But the ability to continue the mission, even if the student has to isolate, is also vitally important. Or, God forbid, we should have to go remote again. We're in a much better place to be able to accomplish that. But that is not our plan. I think we're in as good a shape as anyone else can be, not knowing what's going to happen in the community or around us, or over winter break. And we're doing a good job. We got a great team, so we got good people doing good things. So that's the best we can hope for.
Okay, Dr. Dave Richard, a professor of biology, director of the COVID response team at SU, and Chris Bailey, director of facilities at Susquehanna University. Thank you very much for your time today.
Very welcome.
Thanks, Chris.
Okay, and that's going to do it for this episode of In Your Neighborhood special series, Conversations on COVID-19. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm your host, Chris O'Rourke. We'll see you again next time, and please stay safe out there and wear a mask.